Hi, Josh. Recording. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm just letting everyone trickle in. Sorry, we're starting a couple minutes late. But thanks all for being here. If you wouldn't mind, we'd love to know who's in the room. So if you'd be so kind as to put your name in the chat and maybe the organization you're with, or if you own a farm, your farm name, and also where you're located would be helpful for us to see. And in the interest of time, I'm going to just jump right in. And yeah, really excited for today. My name is Anna Chotzen, and I'm the Director of Farm Viability at Viva Farms. And we're really excited to have Josh Volk here today, who's going to be talking with us about some strategies for investing in equipment and really making investments in general in your farm. So really excited to have Josh here with us today. I did want to just take a minute to thank Washington State University Extension for providing simultaneous Spanish interpretation that we'll have today, and also the Department of Agriculture, and specifically the agency NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, that provided funding for this workshop. So thanks to them. And before we jump in, I'm just going to quickly make an announcement in Spanish about interpretation so that folks who need it can join. And just quickly in English, if you choose to listen in Spanish, there should be a little button at the bottom of your screen and you can just select Spanish. And so I'll just mention that in Spanish as well. Hola a todos. Para los que pueden escuchar en español, puede seleccionar Spanish o español bajo de su pantalla para escuchar en español, y si tengan problemas o preguntas pueden comunicar conmigo en el chat y yo puedo ayudarles. And so with that, I really want to welcome Josh, owner of Solhan Farm, and just looking forward to the conversation today. So Josh, I will pass it to you.
Great. And I'm going to bring up the slides now. So I think my face will possibly go away from many people, but I just thought I would leave my face up here for a second in case folks are interested in who it is that's actually talking to you. We'll go through a little bit of introductions at the beginning. I would love for this to be as interactive as possible. I am going to go through a bunch of quick examples in the beginning. I won't necessarily, I try to ignore what's happening in the chat. So if somebody else from the team wants to kind of clue me into those questions that come through the chat, or if questions come in other ways, that's fine as well. But I would really like people to ask questions when you have them. And I will try and keep the initial part pretty short so that we have lots of time for that. And also, I'm not sure if this word went out, but if people have examples of tool decisions they're trying to make, if any of you have examples of that you want to kind of talk through, that would be fantastic. So I'm going to do some examples from my own farm, just real brief ones, but then I would love to possibly jump into some real examples from other decisions that people are trying to make. So with that
Josh,
said,
sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
Just before you get started, I just wanted to mention that for those who are preferring to listen in Spanish, we just put the Spanish slides in the chat and you can just download those and follow along. There may be a couple slides that are out of order with the English slides, so you might just have to jump around a little bit, but you should be able to follow along from there.
Great. All right, so let's see if I can share this. Okay, see if I can go back here. All right, so just the title slide there, investing in your farm, making decisions about investing in tools, equipment, and more. Essentially what I'm going to say just right up front is this simple framework that I'm putting out Tools are a really obvious place to apply it, but really it is about anything that you are investing in. And I'll kind of talk about what I mean by investing also, because I think it's funny, I was farming for quite a few years, running my own business, and what investing means really didn't sink in. It's used so loosely until a handful of years ago. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Introductions. I'm going to introduce myself, and I appreciate that everybody's putting their information in the chat as well. So, for folks who haven't heard of me before, I have been farming in the Portland area for 25 years. So I'm down in Portland, Oregon. I currently run a small urban farm part-time called Cully Neighborhood Farm. We're on an acre site, but we do really small scale. So we're probably not even doing half of that, and we share that space with some other folks. 50, we do about 55 plus CSA shares, and we go 12 months out of the year. And I've been working with that farm for, I don't know, 6, 8 years, something like that. Before that, I worked on larger farms, and for about the first 10 years that I was farming in different parts of the country, including just outside of Portland, Oregon, I was working full time and running tractors and equipment and that kind of stuff. Before I was farming, I have an engineering degree, and I worked briefly in some factories doing tool design for those factories before deciding that really I wanted to be outside and working with the plants and food and feeding communities was really more what I was interested in. In recent years, my partly because of the influence of my partner, but also just, as you've been in business for longer, you kind of get more of a sense of what's important for running a business. I've gotten more and more involved in bookkeeping side of things and economic analysis and that kind of stuff. And my partner actually went to school and got an MBA about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago. And so I kind of feel like I got the secondary MBA by following her progress through that whole program and discussing all this stuff. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about economic analysis, but I also want to talk about the other considerations which aren't necessarily economic, that you don't necessarily put dollar numbers on. And I'll explain what these little subcategories are later in the presentation. For now, we're just going to jump right into an initial example. So to get us warmed up, the initial example is something that I am currently considering, which is purchasing an electric wheel hoe for my little farm. And so kind of one of the ways that I go and look at this is by simply looking at what is it costing me to do what I'm doing now. So currently I have, and that's this first example, the old system, push wheel hoe. This is probably small for some of you, but I'll read through the whole thing. So pushing a wheel hoe, so just a really regular manual wheel hoe we use for cleaning up our pathways and sometimes doing the bed tops as well. And we have that, so there's no initial cost for us to continue running that. The ongoing costs are really the labor of running it. And the labor of running that, I estimate that we're maintaining about 25 pathways that are 160 feet long. We're making about 12 passes a year on each one of those pathways. It's 4 minutes per pass, and that is at a loaded labor rate of about $18 an hour for us. And so that is costing us about $360 a year. If I were to buy the electric wheel hoe, which looks fantastic, looks like it would save us a lot of energy, probably has some other benefits. The initial cost for that tool, broken down into, kind of assuming it's going to probably last about 10 years. So I've priced this out. I've annualized it to cost per year over that 10 years, and I've just divided it equally. So the full cost is about $1,950 new, divided by 10, that's $195. Um, plus I need to buy batteries, plus I need to buy a charger, plus I need to buy the side knives that would go with it. Plus I need to pay for shipping. And that upfront cost on an annualized basis would be about 292.50. And then the labor that I'm expecting it to save me is, instead of it taking 4 minutes per pass, that it would take about 2 minutes. So it'd have the amount of time. And if I calculate that out, that's $180. And so the total cost per year would be $472.57. In this particular analysis, just, making those really quick uh, estimates, and I'll get a little bit more into where those estimates came from. But just looking at those estimates, this does not make sense. So I would be spending an extra 112.57 per year in order to have this wheel hoe. Now, that it's possible that I would just rather have the wheel hoe and save the physical energy and spend that money. But in this case, this is an investment with a negative return. So it's an investment in the sense of I am putting money into it. Normally with investments, what you are hoping is that they are going to pay a dividend, meaning they are going to either save you money or generate money for you. And in the end, that you're going to end up in a better spot than you were financially. This case, if I look at the estimates that I've made, it's not going to do that. It's going to cost me money. So it's not an investment in that. It's not a good investment. It's an investment that would cost me money in the end. Okay, so that's just super quick example. And I'm going to ask right now, actually, just take a second and say, are there any questions on that really quick analysis that I just did? The numbers of that. All right, so let's go to the next slide here. So there's lots of other considerations that you may think about in that are not the economic ones. And so I just want to go through those really quickly. This is not going to be the primary focus of this talk. The primary focus is going to be looking at the economic considerations. But I want to make sure that I acknowledge these because they are not unimportant. Meaning they are important considerations. So one of them is ripple effects. So if I buy that wheel hoe, that electric wheel hoe, it's going to help me with the pathways, but there are likely ripple effects on the farm in terms of lots of other things that I need to think about, which may or may not have economic impact. And I kind of alluded to one of them, which is just that I'm probably going to have more energy at the end of making these 2-minute passes than I would have after making the 4-minute passes. Even if I'm only making half as many the same amount of time on both, it's going to save me personally energy. And so that would be one ripple effect. Another ripple effect that I didn't talk about is we don't actually have any power on the farm. So one of the estimates that I didn't actually put in there, but is an important consideration, is now I'm going to have to figure out how do I charge the batteries. And so it's going to change some systems around. Where am I going to store this thing? So, those are other potential ripple effects. And then because the tool's around, there may also be other things that it's useful for. And so I'd want to think about those. So when you're making these decisions, you really want to think about, like, okay, I started out with the narrow look at it, but I really want to consider as much as possible all the different aspects that are going to play into, or like that are going to ripple on from what has been happening. Worker and health well-being. So, the energy thing might be one of those. Am I just going to end up being happier at the end of the day? Or the people who work for me, I have 2 employees, would they be a lot happier at the end of the day? Am I potentially avoiding potential injuries from extra strenuous use of the um, manual wheel hoe. Is this gonna, what are the health and well-being considerations here for myself and my workers? Cultural, does it fit into like, is this ergonomically appropriate for the people? Is it something that people would be comfortable using? Does it fit into the culture of the farm? Culture, are people going to accept this tool on the farm? Work enjoyment. So that's just another way of saying some of the things that I've already been saying. How big is the learning curve? And, should I be thinking, oh, well, I should be considering that there's going to be a little bit of a cost in terms of figuring out how to actually use this thing most efficiently. Oftentimes that's for especially if the more complex the tool is, the more that becomes a consideration in what the upfront costs of that tool is going to be, because there's likely going to be a larger learning curve in terms of how do I actually use this tool effectively if I haven't used it before. Volume and scale requirements. So this particular example doesn't work at the volume and scale that I'm at, but you can kind of see that if I had maybe a significant number more beds that I was doing with this same wheel hoe, that initial investment may actually pay off in the labor savings. I'm not spending that much. I'm only spending $360 a year on labor right now. But if I were spending, $1,000 on labor or $2,000 on labor to do this particular task, and I was able to cut that labor cost in half, suddenly that becomes a lot different calculus. And so, does this tool, maybe it doesn't work at the volume and scale that I'm at right now, but maybe it allows me to scale up if that's something that I actually want to do. I don't actually want to scale up. In fact, I'm trying to scale down. And so that's not a good situation for me. I like to think about life cycle analysis. So what's going to happen to the tool at the end of its life cycle? And at the end of its time on the farm, how recyclable are the materials? How reusable are they? Or maybe it's something that I'm going to use for a few years, and is it going to have a resale value? That would be an important piece of the calculation. But also, I'm always considering what went into building this thing. Is it environmentally responsible for me to purchase this tool to support the manufacturers of these kinds of tools? And is that the kind of thing that I want to be putting my money towards, putting my support towards? Flexibility. Does this tool make me more flexible, more nimble? So one of the big draws potentially for this tool is, yes, it'll save me labor. And so that's a potential labor cost savings, but it could actually be even more important to me that it is saving me labor at critical times of year when I don't have enough available labor to do the other tasks that really need to be done. And so that could have a ripple effect in terms of, if I'm unable to get the tasks done with the labor that I have available, but this would make it so that I actually could get those tasks done, that might be another justification for purchasing the tool, even if it's going to cost me a little bit of money, because it may end up saving me some money somewhere else that is not in this particular economic analysis. And then lastly, I'll just mention financial feasibility. So anytime you're making the tool purchase, you have to decide, do I have the funds available to purchase this tool? And even if I do have the funds available to purchase this tool, is this the best use of those funds? So often you might be deciding between 2 or 3 different tool purchases. You have enough funds for 1 or 2 of them, but not all of them. And in that case, you would be doing analysis on all 3 of these and making that decision about which one is going to have the best economic return, as well as the best return for all of these other considerations. Okay, I'll pause there for a second and see if there's any questions on that whole thing. It's a pretty simple analysis. And really this particular analysis took me, I think, about 30 minutes to collect all the information. Now I'm gonna show you that in just a second. So if there's any other questions, people can put them in the chat or just yell them out.
Got one in the chat. It says, do you have any suggestions for integrating other considerations with the economic analysis?
Yes. So it's a good question. Um, One thing that they try and do in economics a lot of time is to take those other considerations and put dollar numbers on them. So with any of those other considerations, if you can put dollar numbers on them, if you can, make some kind of estimate of how much you think that is worth to you dollars wise, then you can just incorporate it straight into the economic analysis, and that becomes fairly straightforward. One of the things that I do when I am deciding on a purchase for the farm, for my business, and it's not clear that it's actually going to save me any money, that it's just literally going to be an expense. As the farm owner, that is essentially an expense out of my pocket. So if I spend 20 bucks on something for the farm and there's no return on that investment, that's just a $20 expense. And at that point, what I need to think about is, or what I think about is, would I rather have that thing or would I rather have $20 in my pocket? And so that's should be totally obvious, but that I literally stop and make that go through that thought process. Like, is it, would I rather have, and I think in your personal life, you're making that decision all the time. I'm going to buy this hat. Oh, would I rather have the 20 bucks or would I rather have the hat? So on the farm, you can do the same thing where it's like, okay, it'd be really nice to have a nice clock in the packing shed or something like that. Well, would it really be, it's like I can't really say that clock is going to save us money or make us money in the packing shed. But would I rather have the clock up there where, it's just kind of this convenience for everybody, for myself, or would I rather have the 15 or 20 bucks that it costs to buy that clock? So that's another thing. I think I I think those two approaches are really the two that I use. Um, and I will say that the other thing is at at some point, whenever you're doing these analyses, the economic analysis, that is one piece of the equation, and all these other things are another piece of the equation. And part of the trickiness of doing business is making those decisions about what is really important for the farm and what can you spend and what can't you spend. And the real point of doing this analysis is not that it's going to make the decision for you, but that it is a tool that you can use that will help you make good decisions about what to purchase for the farm. So, great. Okay. So I'm going to go back and, well, here, I'm going to say a few more things kind of along those same lines. So within this tool, one of the things that you need to do whenever you're making these decisions about um, putting together the numbers, all that kind of stuff, you need to get really comfortable with making estimates and assumptions, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to predict the future. One of the things that really helps you with making estimates and assumptions is having prior experience or going to a source that you can trust that has good prior experience, and using that prior experience to inform your decisions for the future. So to make your best guesses about what's going to happen. So for example, I'm going to their website and I am looking at the prices at this particular moment. And then, that's pretty solid. Like It's always possible that if I put off this decision for 5 weeks or 6 weeks or a year or something, those prices are going to go up. And so then my assumptions are no good anymore. But if I'm, typically when I'm looking at the price of something, that's pretty much the price. So that's a really good assumption for how much this is actually going to cost me if I buy it. The assumptions that I'm making on how long does it take me currently, and meaning to wheel hoe a bed with the manual wheel hoe. I'm assuming that it's going to continue taking me about that long, and I'm assuming that I have good numbers. So that last piece down there is really important, the garbage in, garbage out, GIGO. If you put garbage numbers in, you're going to get garbage numbers out of these equations. And so if you have bad numbers, it's not going to give you good information. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to deal with that. So I'm going to leave that one off for just a second. The assumption that it was going to cut my time in half, I was basing that on information that's on their website about how fast the tool runs. And they had a maximum speed, and then I was kind of playing with some numbers around, okay, well, I don't think I'm going to be able to run it at the maximum speed all the time, so maybe it's going to be a little bit slower. And so I was making my best guess based on having used tools like this before, what they're telling me about this particular tool, how fast do I think it's going to be able to actually run in the field. And if you're not comfortable making those estimates yourself and you're trying to buy a tool from somebody, hopefully you trust the salesperson, the person who's selling it to you, because they're the ones that are going to have the best information about how does this tool actually work. Or even better, if you can find other farmers who have used that particular tool and get numbers from them, then you have the salesperson's information, you have information from other farmers, and then you can kind of average those things and think about, well, which one is more close, do I think is going to be more close to the actual rate that it's going to take me? How do I want to weigh that? And if you're talking to other farmers, you should be thinking about, like, one of the things I was thinking about was, okay, well, these are what my soil conditions are. And, the pictures they're showing and likely the rates that they're talking about look like it's probably for pretty perfect soil conditions. And my soil conditions are, even in the best situations are not perfect. I've got a lot of rocks. There's, a bunch of obstacles. I've got to work around things. I'm probably not going to be running it at the maximum speed that they're talking about. So get comfortable with making estimates and assumptions, but also know how good your estimates and assumptions are. And then another thing that I'm going to switch over here in just a second to, actually, I might do that in a few minutes. I'm going to switch over to Excel at some point. So with my engineering background and actually going even before the engineering days, and I think more and more people are comfortable with spreadsheets at this point. Spreadsheets are fantastic for doing these kinds of estimates. I did that estimate in a spreadsheet. I did not actually set that particular estimate up to be very flexible, but I will show you some tricks for setting up spreadsheets to be flexible so that you can play with the numbers once you've put them in, and really easily make changes that make it possible to look at different scenarios. And so that's another piece. When you're setting it up, you want to set it up your analysis. You can't just do this out on paper. That's totally great. Even if you do it out on paper, if you do everything out more or less longhand, I'm going to just go back to this. So like I made a lot of notes in here about like, where did this $360 number come from? Well, it comes from all these different pieces here. So when you're doing it out, even if you're just doing it on paper, and this is essentially the equivalent of having done it on paper, you want to make those notes to yourself so that if you're going back and you're saying, and you're questioning your assumptions, or you're looking at this 6 months later or a year later to revisit that decision or to decide on a different tool, you remember where those numbers were coming from. And then that makes it easy to go back and look at those again. Okay. I want to go through a couple of terminology things here before I get into more examples. And mention these. These are not, I don't think this terminology is important for anybody who's doing this for themselves. When you start talking to other people, and particularly people who have backgrounds in this kind of thing, maybe the terminology becomes important. But I will also say that having talked to a lot of people who do this kind of stuff, the terminology is not consistent. And people use it very inconsistently. So you may hear these phrases and people may be using them inconsistently. These definitions were put together by my partner with the MBA, who is a stickler about this stuff. And so she like literally took these things out of multiple textbooks and kind of cross-referenced textbooks and that kind of thing. But a lot of people use them much more loosely than this. So the basic concepts are also the important parts here. Partial budget method goes by a lot of different names, and again, people use that term fairly loosely. It's also called incremental analysis or differential analysis or marginal analysis sometimes. The basic point here, and this is essentially what we just did, the example that we just did, is you look at the basic cost and you compare that against the benefit. And when you're looking at it, the reason it's called partial budget is because you're only looking at the parts of the system that you're changing. So the things that I was changing were, I'm purchasing this tool. So that's one of the parts that I'm looking at is the cost of that. I looked at the difference in labor from the old tool to the new tool. That's something that's changing, so I look at that. I did not look at how long does it take me to seed something, because that's part of the farm, but it has nothing to do with this particular analysis. So that's not part of the analysis that I'm going to include. So I try to be inclusive of anything that's going to change and the costs associated with that, or the benefits associated with that. And then I look at what the overall benefit, the net benefit is. Okay, so looks at the specific incremental change to your business to see if the net economic benefits outweigh the economic costs. That's all that's saying. And it's a decision tool to tell you whether or not you'll be better off economically if you make the investment than if you don't. Meaning, is there an economic gain? Same thing. Now, it's not just, again, these kinds of analyses are not just used for tool investments. Any kind of investment that you are making, any kind of change that you are thinking about making on the farm, you can use this same analysis method. And this is a good analysis method to use for any one of those changes. So if you're going to add a crop, if you're going to drop a crop, if you're going to change markets, you're going to start going to a different farmer's market, you'd use exactly this same analysis. You're going to hire somebody, you're going to fire somebody, use exactly the same analysis, give yourself an economic number of what kind of impact is that potentially going to have on the farm. Okay. So just a little bit more on the partial budget method to step it out again. Identify the positive effects from making the investment, any increased revenue, any cost savings. Identify the negative effects from making the investment, any lost revenues, any increased costs. Add together the positive and the negative, and you get the net result. If the positive effects are greater than the negative effects, then there's a net benefit, economic gain. Consider implementing it. If the negative effects are greater than the positive effects, In my case, the negative was greater than the positive, then the costs outweigh the benefits. I'll lose money on the investment. So limitations, it ignores the time value of money. And I'm gonna explain what that is, but I'll explain that later. So just hold on to that one. And the other thing is, this isn't going to tell you whether or not it's going to make your business profitable or not profitable. It's just going to tell you if it's going to make your business better off than it was or not. So you're only analyzing one change at a time here. Okay. Any questions on all of that? Okay. So while I wait for questions to come in, I'm going to talk about another variable or another variation on kind of that same thing. So essentially, you're using the same numbers, but I'm, just calculating it a slightly different way. So in the last one, I looked at kind of what is the annual net benefit, and I had annualized that cost. In this particular one, what I look at is, well, if I buy this thing and it does have an economic benefit, how long is it going to take for that economic benefit to pay back the initial investment? So I'm going to switch screens here for just a second. Okay, so let me see if I can. This is a really simple example. I wrote a book a handful of years ago, came out during the pandemic, called Build Your Own Farm Tools. And this is in the back section in one of the appendices. I actually think the appendices are one of the better parts of that book. There are lots of different tools that you can build yourself. In the book, they're particularly focused on small scale, and this is one of the tools, and it is a tool that we use at Cully Neighborhood Farm, which is a rolling bed marker. You can now buy these. Neversink Farm Tools makes a version of this. But you can build your own as well. And I estimated at the time that I wrote the book, I estimated that construction costs were about $85. So not particularly expensive to build. And that includes paying yourself $15 an hour. So maybe those numbers need to go up at this point. But what I looked at here was with the rolling bed marker, each bed takes approximately 30 seconds for us to mark. And without the rolling bed marker, it takes about 2 minutes to mark. So this one cut our time by, basically it takes us a quarter of the amount of time to do it as opposed to half the amount of time with that previous example. Labor savings per bed is 1.5 minutes. And $15 an hour is 25 cents per minute. So it's about 37.5 cents per bed marking. And we mark about 120 beds in a year. So if we're marking 120 beds in a year, that's $45 in cost savings. The construction cost is $85. So if I divide 85 by 45, it's going to take me 1.9 years to recover that that initial investment in the parts and labor for building that bed marker. And after that, any savings basically are added income for me. So I had the expense up front, and then it takes me 2 years to pay off that expense. And then after that, it's paying back. So that's just another way of looking at exactly the same thing. So I go through that same example, but I add this layer of dividing it to figure out how long is it going to take to pay back. All right, any questions on that particular example? And I am not able to see the notes anymore, so the chat.
Questions in the chat right now.
Go back to the slideshow in that case. I can find it. Okay, so that's the example with the payback method. And here's the summary of that. What's the investment required? What's the annual net cash inflow, meaning what's the savings after you have that investment? And then you divide the two to get the payback period. Very, very simple. And just another explanation of exactly the same thing. This method is completely scale neutral. So, it's like I'm talking about tools that are, hundreds of dollars, maybe a couple $1,000s. You're going to buy a new tractor, exactly the same method. Spend $30,000 on a harvester, exactly the same method for calculating this out. Might be a little bit more complicated in terms of there may be more factors that you need to factor in. But even with really large equipment, a lot of the times it's, as simple as how long is it going to take me in terms of how much labor do I have with that first item, the current method, and how much labor is the new method going to save me. And then, of course, how long it takes to pay back is, that depends on how you're going to use the tool on your farm. And so that's one of those assumptions that you're making about the future and one of those things that you need to consider carefully. Okay, I just want to mention what net present value is because you'll probably, if you're looking at this kind of information, you'll probably see this term at some point. It is not particularly difficult to calculate, and it is useful in some circumstances, but it's a little bit confusing, especially when you're first trying to wrap your head around it. And if you're not using it all the time, I don't think it's actually useful enough to really use in most analyses. What net present value gets used for mostly is in business, if you are considering the difference between two different tool investments, for example, that are quite large, meaning the dollar outflow is going to be quite large, but they have different time horizons. So one of those tools is going to last for 5 years and the other tool is going to last for 15 years. And if you, and they're going to, the other thing is that they're going to have major maintenance expenses or consumable expenses on different timelines. So, in 2 years and then in 4 years, and then that 5-year tool is going to have certain expenses, and the other one is going to have expenses in 5 years and in 10 years and in 15 years. And the basic idea here is that a dollar today is not the same as a dollar 5 years from now. So if you have a dollar right now, it will buy you, it has so much buying power. So you can buy whatever with that dollar now. But 5 years from now, it may cost you $1.50 to buy that same thing because of inflation. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring all of the numbers for future years back into what their present value is. So you use something called a discount rate, which is basically what you expect inflation to be, or the other way that businesses often do it is they will say, well, if I just stuck this money into an investment fund, what's the rate of return that I would get on that, or a savings account or something like that. And then you use that as your discount rate. So if your savings if you have a high yield savings account that maybe is returning 3% or 5%, you might use 3% or 5% as your discount rate. And then you bring all of those numbers back into the present. And so $1.50 in 5 years relates back to the dollar now, and those are basically the same number. If you're not following this, don't worry about it because it's not really that important for most of the purchases that you're probably going to be making for farm businesses, unless you're making really, really large investments, and then it may be worth either doing a little research to figure that out on what net present value is in order to figure that out for yourself, or working with somebody who understands how to use those calculations appropriately. So I mostly just put it in here to say it exists. This is what it's for, but I don't actually think that it's something that's going to be appropriate for most people to be using. And the reason for that is that most of the purchases aren't really that big and don't have that for the farm and don't really have that many different moving parts that are that large. And most people aren't necessarily going to be investing that money in other equipment. Now, the other thing that the other factor that comes up that's related to net present value, in a sense, is the cost of money. And this is basically if you take a loan, if you need to take a loan out, if you're considering taking a loan out in order to be able to purchase a tool or to do anything on the farm, there's going to be an interest rate and fees that are associated with that loan. And so what you want to be aware of is that ongoing expense of that interest expense and any of the upfront fees. So even if you don't have the cash flow to cover one of these things, if you can calculate that it's going to save you a significant amount of money, as long as it's going to save you more than what that interest payment would be and the associated fees would be, it may actually be a good investment. And that's kind of related to net present value because you can use the interest rate as one of those discount rates to calculate on some of those things in certain situations. Okay, so if all this is getting really feels like it's getting really wonky and you're just like, oh man, I just want to think about, it's like, do I want this thing? Do I not want this thing? Kind of what's my gut feeling on whether or not it's going to, I'm not going to bother doing all these numbers. There's a great line section in the book Fearless Farm Finances, which organization which used to be called Moses and now is called Marblestone. I think that's what it's called. Midwest farmer organization similar to Tilth out here. They put together a book 10 or 15 years ago on financial analysis for farms, and it's a good collection of authors that all went together on this thing, and some of it I think it's written for farms of all different sizes. So there's some of it that's not necessarily applicable to maybe the type of farm that you have, but a lot of good information in there. And Paul Detman, who's a really well respected farm economist, agricultural economist. He has this wonderful line, which I'll read to you. In reviewing the draft of this book, one farmer commented that doing all this analysis, quote, takes the fun out of buying something new, end quote. And then he comes back with facing bankruptcy at the end of a long series of poorly considered investment decisions tends to take the fun out of farming too. And that is really the point here is if you are feeling like I don't really want to do all this financial stuff, that's fine if you have money to spend on this stuff and you don't need the investment to pay back. But if you're trying to make this work sustainably financially, and you don't have an unlimited trust fund, then you need to be aware of these calculations and tracking all of this. And this is a tool that will help you do this. Okay, that is the end of the slideshow. And at this point, whoops, just screw myself up here. I'm going to go stop this screen share and ask if there are any questions about any of that piece that I went through. And what I would really like is if there are examples of, if somebody wants to volunteer an example of an investment that they are thinking about, and we can step through that. While you are thinking about whether or not you want to be that person and you're brave enough to put your example up there, I'm going to pull up Excel and share that screen and show you some of the back end of what I'm talking about with setting your analysis up so that it's flexible. Let me see if I can.
We've got someone in the chat that's willing to step up with an example when you're ready.
Great. Okay, let's just go ahead and jump straight into the example. Is that Rebecca?
Yeah, hi, I'm Becky.
Okay, Becky. So go ahead, give me your example.
Yeah, so I co-manage a about 2-acre farm, and we are thinking about getting the quick greens harvester. We do grow a lot of salad. We're just cutting by hand, but I think economically, like I haven't tried to break it down into actual numbers, but the things that are sort of stopping us from just trying it out are that it is a decent amount of money, and we're not really sure if it works if you have weeds in your bed, like how would it actually play out in practice. It seems like a little bit too much to just be like, well, we'll just try it out and see.
Okay, so that's a great example. It's funny actually that you picked that example because the slideshow that I showed you guys was a modified version of a slideshow that my partner and I did about 5 years ago at the Oregon Small Farms Conference. And the piece that I pulled out was an example of a salad harvester. So we get the example of the salad harvester
Nice.
here instead. Okay, so
Josh, if I can interrupt real quick, the spreadsheet's pretty hard to see.
oh,
If you're able
yeah,
to.
here, let me do this, and I think this will tell me when that gets a little bit better. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so 2-acre operation, quick greens harvester. Okay, so first thing you need to know is how long is it taking you to harvest greens right now? Do you have an estimate of that?
That's a great question. Probably a couple people for an hour twice a week would be a really rough estimate.
1 hour per week. Okay.
Twice a week.
Oh, 1 hour. Three times per week. Okay, and then do you happen to know off the top of your head what your loaded labor rate is?
I don't know that term, but we're paying $16.50.
Okay, so
That wouldn't
when I
include
say
all the
loaded,
taxes and stuff.
labor rate, what the loaded labor rate would be is the dollars per hour that you are paying them, so what the wage is, plus any other payroll expenses. So those are things like Social Security, Medicare, if you pay any benefits, any of those types of things.
Right.
So
I
if
guess,
it's,
yeah, my business partner would know that more, but whatever the standard sort of, what do you think of it, like 25% that goes into Medicare and things like that?
yeah, it's probably less than that, but we can just put that number in. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, sorry, what did you say the number was again? 16 something?
1650.
Okay, so I'm going to use a formula here, and I'm going to say 16.5 times 1.25, just assuming that it's 25%, which is an overestimate, but if that's all, if you're just paying regular employment taxes, probably an overestimate. So that'd be 2065. And then just to make it clearer for myself that it's a dollar amount, I'm just going to format that as a dollar. And then what I'm going to do, and this is one of those places where I'm saying, set this up so that it's easy to play with these things in the future. I am not putting the text into this. I'm just leaving the number here, and then I'm going to put the text next to it and say loaded labor rate. Okay, so now we have that number here. We can easily change that number, right? But we always know that the loaded labor rate is right here. Okay, and then 2 people, 1 hour, 2 times per week. And then this is the, so I'm going to start just doing some items here. Okay, so, and we'll do current method. I can type. Okay, so get that out of there, put that there. Move this over here. Okay, so now to set this up so that it's easy to play with later, I'm going to separate out all these different pieces. Well, actually, I'm just going to do it simply. So I'm just going to say equals 2 times 1 times 2, and then how many weeks?
Oh, that's a good question. 40
40 weeks?
is rough estimation.
Oops. So that's going to equal this, oops, times this, times the loaded labor rate, right? And then the loaded labor rate, even if we copy this formula somewhere else, so we may use this same thing down here, but we always want it to pull from that same one. And so in order to do that, I'm going to make this an absolute cell reference. Oops. And to make it an absolute cell reference, you put dollar symbols in front of here. So I'm not going to go too much into the Excel stuff, but I'm going to give you a whole bunch of clues along the way. So I'm not going to explain these too much, but okay. So you are spending about, based on those estimates, this is saying you're spending about $3,300 in labor currently, and you're just hand harvesting, is that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a lot more than I would have expected.
So now I've set this up so this is flexible because you said, well, these are all estimates. I don't know what it is. And we'll get back to that in a second. So maybe you look at that number and you say, well, this isn't such a great estimate right now. But also maybe you just never calculated out that number and maybe it actually is a good estimate. You just hadn't thought about what the total is. So part of the great thing about doing this is it's like you start to look at these things and put numbers on them and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. So I've done this a lot with crops on my farm and done crop budgets, for example. In the old, and this is a little aside here, but it's kind of illustrating why this is so important. I used to think that carrots were terrible. Like I was like, oh my God, it takes so much time and it is so miserable to keep them weeded, and I must be losing money on carrots, but people love them, so I'm going to keep growing them. And then when I did crop budgets, like actually calculated out how good the carrots were, and they turned out to be one of my best crops. I was like, wow, that's crazy. But within doing those crop budgets, I could see why that worked for me and why they ended up being one of my best crops. And because I had all the numbers on all the different factors there. So yeah, they still were miserable to put all that weeding labor into. That didn't change that, except that it did change my attitude about it, because instead of thinking as I'm out there weeding them that I'm losing money, I was out there thinking, okay, I'm making money, yeah, it's miserable, but I'm making money right now doing this weeding. So this is I feel like this is a great process to go through, just to understand how much it's costing you to go through your do the different pieces of the crop production. Okay, so aside done. Okay, so if you make this change, you are going to change that labor. And are there any other labor costs that are going to change?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Not sure. Okay.
Mm.
That's fine. So that's the obvious one. Okay, so let's just leave that there. And then we'll say the new method.
Someone just added in the chat, potentially wash pack labor could change.
Yeah, I'll get to that. Yes. Oh, lost my headset. Okay, so new method. How much does this tool cost?
I believe it's $750 before tax, but
$750?
yeah,
Okay, and does that include shipping?
probably not.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just and then I'm gonna do this.
Oh, okay, free shipping. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Um, so I'm just making a note there so that you remember that. And then what do you expect the rate to be on harvesting this? Have you on harvesting with this greens harvester? Have you looked into
I
that
think
at all?
that's right. I think that's the question. I mean, their website says up to 9 times faster. So, you could go with that. Or you said earlier, like learning curve. And then I think the
Mhm.
main thing I'm actually worried about is we don't have a perfect stand of salad every time. How is it going to work? Like, so that translates into somebody said higher wash pack labor if you're picking out all the weeds, or you need to buy a bubbler or something to change your whole system. Um, but I guess, for this example, do we want to just come up with yeah, somebody said in the chat
Mhm.
about how fast they're able to harvest.
Yeah. So and I'm glad they did that, because the I'm going through this, kind of just in this very rough format, the way that you're giving it to me. And then we'll go back and we'll refine this a little bit more. But that that rate there is given in pounds per how many minutes per pound. And so it's talking about pounds. We weren't talking about pounds here.
Right.
So if that, if it's like, okay, well, I've got one set that's not in pounds and the other one that is in pounds, then we have to figure out what the conversion
Yeah.
rate is. So we've got somebody saying what the greens harvester is going to do. So let's convert that one into the pound, like the amount of pounds that this is representing. So you're doing how many pounds? Do you know how many pounds in a year? Do you know how many pounds in a harvest? What number do you have that might relate to that?
Like in a particular harvest that takes us an hour with a couple of people, 25.
Okay, so I'm just gonna slide over here. So you're saying,
20 pounds.
okay, so 20 pounds. I'm gonna do this, 20 pounds. And then that is for one of your harvests. Harvest. Okay. And this is the number of hours per week. So that's actually 2 hours. So your harvest rate is this divided by this. So that's 10 pounds per hour, right? And then, this is really easy to change. It's like, okay, well, if actually you went back and you were like, oh, actually, we're not doing 20, we're doing 30. So I changed that and it automatically changes this. So that's kind of where I'm saying, set this up so that you can play with it. You can make these changes really easily. But let's go back to that 20 pounds. Okay, so 10 pounds per hour. This is harvest rate. I'm just making myself a note here. What is this that I'm actually looking at? I'm gonna give myself an outline so I know that this part goes by itself. So it's just, so I'm doing some formatting stuff just to make these notes clearer to myself so that when I come back to this spreadsheet next week, I remember what all this stuff meant. Um, okay, so, and then I'm gonna do some more of that. I'll make this bold. We'll make this bold. So make these two set up. Okay, so um,
That was probably at least a little bit low. I think maybe 30 is maybe more
30. Okay, well, let's
more
do 30.
accurate.
And for the sake of this example, for the sake of this example, it doesn't really
Yeah.
matter. These are all just numbers,
It's
and
not super accurate. Perfect.
you can play with these, but yeah, let's try and get it as close as possible. Okay, so the new greens harvester, if you're doing 30 pounds per harvest, and actually I'm gonna do another thing here. So you were saying that it's 2 harvests per week times 40. So this equals that times 2 times 40. And actually it's times 30 pounds per harvest. Sorry. So that times that times 2. So that would be 2,400 pounds per year. Does that sound about right? Any sense of whether or not that?
I would have to think about, how much I sell a week and stuff like that to see if that makes sense. But
Okay. So the reason why I just pulled this number here is because now we know that um, um, we're going to do a different setup here. So this is an hour. This is just trying, like, lots of different ways to set this up. So 30 pounds per harvest. Okay, so the harvest time with the new, just so we have it in the same format as the old system, harvest time with the new system. And somebody said, was it 60 pounds per 25 minutes? So that is going to equal 60 pounds per 25 minutes divided by 60 will give us the per hour rate. So that's 144 pounds per hour.
That's
And then 30 pounds is that's hours per harvest. This is going to be equals doing 30 pounds per harvest. And I'm going to divide that by 144 by that. Okay, so now your hours per harvest is 0.2. And that's 2 times a week. This is probably really exciting watching me do this, but and again, 40 weeks. And we'll copy that. Okay, so your labor now goes down to 343.75. And of course, you want to double check that I've done all the math correctly here on this sheet. But assuming I've done it all correctly and nobody's caught all the mistakes that I've made here, hopefully I haven't made too many mistakes, but if there are mistakes, going from, I can see really quickly that your total cost here is $3,300, right? And your total cost here for a year, including the purchase of the tool, if that's the only cost that it is, which is not quite the only cost, but we're just going to, for the sake of this example in the short term, is $1,093.75.
right. So that's why we're strongly considering it, but I think there's a lot of
Right. So
hidden drawbacks.
yeah. So let's start getting into a bunch of the other pieces right now. One of the things that I just want to do before we get into those other pieces is I've already been showing this a little bit, but as you get better numbers, or if you want to play with scenarios and you say, well, yeah, 4 hours per week, but what if we could actually just get our crew to work faster and they were working 2 hours and they were doing 2 hours per harvest? How would that change the scenario? So it's really easy. Or what if we were only doing 20 weeks instead of 40 weeks? I go back and look at my numbers, and then how does that change things around? So you can change all these numbers around if you set it up appropriately in the beginning. Then you can go back and you can use this to change everything around really quickly and run lots of scenarios. And running scenarios is a great thing to do for the future. And one of the things that I would highly recommend is don't just run one scenario. So run kind of a best case, like your best guess, like, okay, on average, I think it's going to do about this. So that's my best guess. And then run, okay, but if things didn't work out very well, what's my worst case scenario? If it's still going to pay off in what you think is the worst case scenario, then that makes the decision a lot easier. But if it pays off in the average scenario, but it doesn't pay off in the worst case scenario, then you have to think about, well, how good are my numbers really? And then a lot of times you can do the best case scenario too. Then that one's just fun to run. But maybe if it doesn't pay off in the average scenario, but it does pay off in the best case scenario, you can say, well, again, you can be like, how good are my numbers? Or do I think I could get it closer to this best case scenario? Hopefully that is relatively clear.
In a
So we'll
row.
come back to all the missing pieces over here. So there's definitely a lot of things that are missing from this analysis. And just off the top of my head, and I think some people have been putting some of this into the chat. I'm going to ignore what's in the chat because you guys can read that there. And I'm going to just tell you the things that come to my mind quickly. So the cost of the greens harvester, you definitely want to add shipping in there. And you want to think about, are there maintenance costs that are going to go along with this? So you may have a maintenance cost with your current method, which is sharpening knives. But you're probably going to have to sharpen this greens harvester. You're probably going to have to charge batteries. You're probably going to have to, I think the greens harvester, I don't know if this is the price with a motor or without the motor. Any more costs that are associated with purchasing that.
Right, I think
Is
it
it
runs
going
off,
to,
but I think it runs off a drill, which we have, but like
you
drill
have the drill, but are you
maintenance.
going to, how often are you
Right.
going to go through drills?
Exactly.
So that, that's another ongoing cost that you would want to try to factor in there. Because, even if you have a drill right now, it's going to create extra wear and tear on those things that you already have. And with any piece of equipment, people are probably familiar with the term depreciation. And a lot of times depreciation, is associated pretty exclusively with taxes, and that is one type of depreciation. But the other way to think about depreciation and kind of the way to use it for your business analysis is to think about how quickly something's going to wear out and basically go to zero value. So if the drill is going to last for 3 years, then you would essentially depreciate that cost of that drill over 3 years. The easiest way to do that is just what's called straight line depreciation, which is dividing it in. And it's what I did. Straight line depreciation is what I did in that first example that I gave you guys, where I just divided it over 10 years. I said, okay, I think this tool is going to last for 10 years. And so I'm just going to straight line divide it by 10. In your bookkeeping, in your analysis of the tools, in your analysis of the business, you should be depreciating tools or anything that you're investing in, anything that you're spending money in that is lasting you more than a year. You should be dividing that expense over the years that you think it's going to last and putting that expense in each specific year. So that's a bookkeeping method where that thing is an asset and then it gets a depreciated expense. I'm not going to get into that a whole bunch, but the idea is, like, if you were to purchase something in the first year, what you don't want to do is you don't want to look at your overall business profitability for that year if it's an incredibly expensive purchase and say, oh man, I wasn't profitable this year. And then the next year, you don't have that same expense, but you're still benefiting from that expense. And you say, wow, I was super crazy profitable this year. You want to spread that out over time so you can kind of see how that is. And part of what that does is it allows you to have the money in your budget for replacing those tools when that replacement cost needs to come around. So that's kind of it's a little bit tangential to this particular analysis, but that's another important part of figuring out what the costs over time are. So the other thing that besides just the purchase price and the tool itself is that buying a greens harvester is likely going to change more than just the way that you harvest the greens. So it's probably the greens harvester is part of a system, and you may have other pieces of the system already in place, but if you don't, then you're going to be making changes to those other pieces of the system. And when I talk about the system that the greens harvester is a part of, one of the pieces of the system is the way that your crops are, your salad mix is planted. It is designed to harvest off of a very flat bed with very even germination and very low weed pressure. And so if you need to make changes in order to get all those things in place, when you're hand harvesting, you can harvest off of a pretty uneven bed and you can sort out a bunch of weeds while you're harvesting and you can get a pretty even cut. But if you don't have all those things in place with the greens harvester, then that's going to mean that there's trickle down. And so you would want to include in this particular analysis, you would also want to include all of those changes to your planting system because that's part of the partial analysis. That's part of this particular analysis that you're doing.
Right. Alternatively, it seems like you could sort of think about it as like a percentage of the time we have a really great salad bed and we could use the harvester in those cases, and the other percent of the time we would go back to hand harvesting, and that could almost also be figured into this
Right,
calculation.
exactly. And if you do it that way, so if you only are considering part of the time, then you would only consider the amount of time. So for example, like I changed this from 40 to 20. So that's saying, okay, well, maybe if only 50% of the time your beds were in good shape, that would be the savings here. So I'm not considering that other 20 weeks because I'm just considering these 20 weeks. So that's exactly what you're doing here. So yeah, that's a great point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And then on the tail end, there's more things. So how you're washing and packing those greens. If you go from a quick cut harvester that's going to cut everything in the bed, so it's going to cut including the weeds. If you're hand harvesting, there's a lot more sorting that tends to go on with hand harvesting in the field. Then you transfer that sorting labor to the wash pack. And so then you need to be doing more sorting in the wash pack area. And so that's going to be usually one of the places where you have to consider the labor. The other thing that's going to change, and with harvest tools, I would say typically instead of setting it up the way that we've set it up here with the how many hours a week are you currently doing and the number of weeks, I would do it more this way, where it's what is my current harvest rate and what do I think the harvest rate is going to change to? Because even if you are cutting off the exact same bed, your yield number is probably also going to change between hand harvesting and machine harvesting. And typically that yield is going to go down a little bit because with hand harvesting, you can make those micro adjustments to the cut and you can cut the uneven bed and you can get stuff off of the uneven sections that you would not be able to get off with the salad greens harvester. And so the point there really is if it's going to make a change in the yield on the bed, you want to know that as well and factor that into the decision. So that's one of those trickle down effects, one of those ripples, but that is actually one that you can put an economic number on. Okay. Anything that I'm missing from the chat that does anybody have more questions on that particular example or?
We have somebody else with another example, but not, I think you covered most of the things about the harvester.
Okay, great. Yeah, what's the other example?
Frederick, Fred, do you want to talk about the spader?
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Okay, yeah. I've been using tillers, and we have a lot of clay in our soil. We create a kind of bottom pan that is problematic for drainage and all kinds of reasons. So I'm considering a spader, but I'm considering it at the community level, where if I'm the one who initiates the purchase of the spader, and I can share it, job it out, and help pay for it that way. And I'm looking at about a 10-year horizon. But it's a very expensive piece of equipment. It's somewhere between 10 and 12K.
Okay, so I'm just going to start putting up some stuff here and capturing some of this. Let's just put in a number. And so you're saying the initial investment would be about 12,000.
Yeah, right. I mean, so the tractor is existing.
Yep.
It's just putting that to use, which is why I wouldn't go to a walk behind,
Yep.
because I've already invested in the tractor.
Yep.
And there's a lot of producers. I live on an island, and there's a lot of producers here. So it's something that I would like to sort of test the waters and find out what enthusiasm there is for going in the same direction. We all have, it's glacial till, but with a good deal of clay.
Yeah.
So we all have the same problems with using tillers. And I'm looking for a solution that I can feel good about. So
Yeah.
it's not just an economic thing. It's also an environmental thing.
Right. But you can probably put some economic numbers on this whole thing, and at
that
the
I have,
very least figure out how much is it going to cost you
yeah,
per year.
yeah,
And so let me take a stab at some of the initial pieces here, and I'll at least put placeholders in for numbers to be generated, but we can also kind of toss in rough estimate guesses at this particular moment. And
sure.
let's say, okay, so the kinds of things that we want to include in here. So the initial investment, that's one thing. So you're expecting it's going to be about $12,000.
Yeah,
And then you're going to want to do calculations of what the ongoing costs are. And those are going to be things like, and I'm just going to put this as a header, so I'm just going to bold that. So those are going to be
maintenance.
things like periodic maintenance and the cost. What I'm going to say is the cost per acre. So how much is it costing you to work up an acre with this particular piece of machinery? Does that make sense?
Right. Yep. It's an unknown number at this point.
Right. And what would go into that cost per acre is the labor to drive the piece of equipment.
Sure.
So the tractor operator, the wear and tear on the tractor itself.
Fuel.
So, just like cars have a, kind of a cost per mile to run, a tractor has a cost per hour to operate. And so
Yeah.
you want an estimate of that. And then that periodic maintenance and the initial investment cost on the spader itself, those are going to be folded into a cost per hour to run the spading machine itself.
Sure.
And then you can figure out, so, okay, the labor, the cost of the tractor, the cost of the spader, how much is it costing per acre to operate this particular piece of machinery
Sure.
to spade up the ground. And then you would do that exact same analysis for the tiller. Does that make sense?
Oh, I see. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so then you can figure out, okay, this is the difference in how much it costs to do the spading versus how much it costs to do the tilling, the current system that we're doing.
Okay.
Now, the other factors here, hopefully, is that you have a current, I think the simplest way to think about this is you have a current crop yield with your tiller.
Sure.
and you have ideally what you would want to look at is not just the so there's a price associated with that, and that'll give you a gross revenue, but you ideally want to look at what is my net revenue. And so you would need to have a sense of how much is it costing me to produce that entire crop.
Sure. Yeah.
And then you would say, okay, so my yield and the amount of time that it's taking me to do the other operations in order to get that yield is going to potentially change with this spading machine.
Okay.
And how good an estimate can I make of how much that is going to change? And the places where I would expect that to change would be in the crop yield itself. So right now, it sounds like you have some compaction issues and some waterlogging issues because of the tilling. And
Right.
that is probably reducing your crop yield on, especially on your target crops.
Yeah, my
And
understanding is that with a spader, you can get out earlier in the season.
Yep.
It can handle wetter soil, and so there's a built-in advantage there too.
that can be the case. I've used spading machines quite a bit, and I will say that in relatively well-drained soil, they were far better at getting out in wet conditions. I don't have experience with them on like super heavy wet soils,
Yep.
but
Yeah.
if you're getting that information, then yes. And so that might be one where you're saying, okay, by having this particular piece of equipment with the tiller, I can't even get a crop, but with the spading machine, I can get this crop and it's going to pay this much money. And so then that's the difference between $0
Yeah.
of income and some positive number of dollars of income. Hopefully it's
Right.
positive numbers of dollars of income. You can produce the crop at
Right.
an
Yeah.
actual return. Or you might say, well, I can still get the crop, I just get it later. And because I get it later, I only make this much money on it. But if I could get it earlier, I could make more money on it. And so that would be the difference that you would be looking at.
Sure. Yeah. So if you're on the land earlier, and if you're doing sequential plantings, it may be a benefit there too.
It might, right. And so you would just, I mean, all you're doing with this system is you're putting actual numbers on that. How much of
I
a
see.
benefit would it potentially be?
Sure. That
Yeah.
would take some figuring.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the process here is it's, going through and trying to do a good job of thinking about what are all the different factors that are going to change. Not what are all the different factors, but what are all the different factors that are going to change if I make this change to the system.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot to consider, and this has been informative. Just going through your spreadsheets and seeing the things that you're taking into account. But some of those costs, sometimes it's hard to put a number on the environmental stuff.
Right.
And
Right. And so you don't necessarily have to put a number on everything. Like you don't have
yeah,
to put a number on that environmental piece.
yeah,
Because that is really difficult to put a number on, and you're not actually going to get paid for that necessarily.
no,
So
no,
you're doing that. So then, it's like, if I can say, oh, well, it's gonna have this positive impact for the future environment,
sure,
but I'm not going to get paid for that, but it's going to cost me $2,000. What you could say is the decision that I essentially would be making would be, okay, would I rather have the slightly degraded environment from the tiller and $2,000 in my pocket, or would I rather spend $2,000 to have that improvement to the environment?
sure, yeah.
But you need
Yeah.
to come up with that number, that initial number where it's like, okay, this is the actual dollar difference that it's going to be. That's what we're trying to get at right here
A
with this whole
comparison.
process is like, what is
Sure.
the dollar difference?
Sure.
And then that is one of the pieces of information that you're going to fold into the decision about whether or not to actually make that investment.
Sure.
With the other, pieces of the decision, including things like environmental impact.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, given the soil degradation that's so common now with current practices, it's hard for me not to take that into consideration.
No, you should be. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I want to mention with this particular example, and this is really the same with all of these, and I've mentioned it already, but I just wanted to come back to it, is with a tool like a spading machine or a tractor, something like that. Oftentimes you will say, I'm going to use this tool. I expect to use this tool for 10 years.
Yeah.
But it's going to have a salvage value at the end of that 10 years. And
Sure.
so you're not necessarily going to work it completely into the ground. Some people will work the piece of equipment completely into the ground and it will be worth nothing at the end. With big pieces of steel like tractors and spading machines, there's almost always some salvage value because the steel itself is worth something.
Yeah.
And so when you do your analysis and you are dividing that, you're kind of depreciating that, dividing that over the years, you want to put that salvage value at the end. So if it's, you're going to own this tractor for 10 years and I think I'm going to be able to sell it, you would take the purchase price and you would subtract the sales price, and then you would divide that over the difference between those two over the time. Now, this is
Yeah.
actually where that net present value starts to come into play, because
Sure.
if you think about things like the Alice-Chalmers G tractor, I don't know if people are familiar with that, but that's a cultivating tractor. When those were brand new, they made them in the late 40s, early 50s. And when they were brand new, they sold for less than $2,000, I think. Because, and that was quite a bit of money at that time.
Sure.
Now you'd have a hard time buying one used for $2,000 probably. So if you were just to do a straight line depreciation over that, well, it's like, well, that tractor didn't cost me anything but it's 100 years, it's almost 100 years, sorry, not 100, it's almost 80 years later.
Sure.
And $2,000 if you had $2,000 80 years ago, that's much different than having $2,000 today. And so
Absolutely.
that's where you start thinking about the time value of money and you want to start correcting for that. So you think about the salvage value of these larger pieces of equipment, but you think about the salvage value at the current value of that money, not at the face value of that money.
Okay. Okay. It's with equipment like this, especially if it's well made. I'm looking at longer horizons. Although my own time is limited because of my age.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, at some point that starts to become a factor, doesn't it?
yeah, yeah. But it could go on to do good work elsewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yes. All right. Let's see if there's more questions here. I'm not tracking the.
I think we're continuing to talk about the harvester and some of the experience using it.
Great. Yeah. I love that. The topic of the thing is investing in the tools, but there's all this background information on the specific tool. So it's a little additive incentive for people to put in there. The question, if there's another tool that somebody's interested in considering, it seems like there's a lot of experience in the audience, and that kind of exchange is fantastic.
Well, do you think, Josh, do you have any other content if there aren't any other examples, or do you think we're just, we're closing in on 6 o'clock, so probably unless there's a
Yeah.
really short additional example, we're probably running close. But I guess maybe I would just put that out if anybody else has a burning question or question about something that you're grappling with on your farm that you would like Josh's thoughts on. Now is the time. So just give a moment for that before we move on.
Yeah, and I think I've got time for one more example if somebody wants to do that. In the interim, I'm going to go back to I haven't shown you guys this yet, but I just wanted to show you a little bit of that background on where those numbers came from for that electric wheel hoe. And if somebody else jumps in with another example, I'm happy to switch over to that example. But otherwise, this will be the last piece of information that I pass along tonight. The EOX on the website's 1950. I also would need to purchase batteries for it. The batteries are 179. And then I looked at, okay, well, how much are these things going to cost me to charge? And so you can kind of get an estimate of that because that's 18-volt battery, 5 amp hour, and 90 watt hours. And so you can use those numbers. PG, which is my utility, they're charging 1634 per kilowatt hour. And so it's really only 3 cents per charge. And then I'm assuming an hour runtime. They say 90 minutes on the site, up to 90 minutes. But I made the estimate down. So that is where I'm getting my cost down here. Where was that?
Hey, Josh, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
My name's Renee. I farm with Becky, actually. I guess I have your Making Farm Tools book, and I don't have quite the engineering skill you have. But when I think about like making a farm tool versus buying a farm tool, like how do you work that sort of into a spreadsheet? Or like how do you make your decision about buying a farm tool versus making one?
So there's 2 factors in there. That's a great question. For anything that you do on the farm, even though you are not necessarily, I mean, most people who own farms are going to be sole proprietors or some version of that. And so a lot of people don't put a wage rate on their own time. But I do try and put a wage rate on my own time, which is kind of my target for what I want to be making.
That makes sense.
And I also, kind of in terms of running scenarios, I have a target for what I want to be making. And then I also have kind of like, well, here's my average loaded wage rate. And so if I were to pay somebody else to do this, this is how much it would be. And I kind of look at both of those 2 different things. So the target might be higher than that. Well, typically it is higher than that. I would like to be making more than my employees. I'd like to be making at least as much as my employees. I should say that. So that's one factor in the whole thing. The other factor that tends to happen for me in terms of whether I decide to purchase a tool or to make the tool is I'm pretty much only making tools if I think they're going to be cheaper for me to make them or better. And most of the time, when I'm thinking about making a tool, it's because that tool is either very, very expensive relative to what I think I can make, or it just is not even available to purchase. Like I would have to pay somebody else to custom build it. And so that's cost prohibitive, and it's much cheaper for me to do it. also, if you get proficient with making these things, you can do them much more quickly. And, a lot of my time, this is part of just the way my head works. I'm thinking about improvements to things all the time. And so I would like to play with that. And so I'm fine with investing a little bit of time in prototyping things. And I have gotten fast enough to prototype them. But to be honest, I rarely actually calculate those out for very small tool changes. I only do it if it's a much larger tool. So, if I'm thinking about making minor changes to our wash pack area, kind of moving plumbing around or that kind of thing, I know that, that's maybe going to take me an hour and minimal cost in materials. I have a sense that my hour is worth, $20 an hour, $25 an hour, whatever it is. So that's basically going to be the expense to try out this new system. And that's not worth it for me to sit down and spend another hour costing out how much difference it's going to make.
Oh, that makes sense.
But if I'm thinking about spending, time on a project that's going to take me 2 or 3 days and is maybe going to be a few $100s in materials, then that hour of, sitting down, half an hour of sitting down and costing it out starts to make a little bit more sense. Like, do I think this is actually going to be a worthwhile change?
Okay, yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. Great.
There's one other question. I know we're closing in on time, but from Brooke, trying to develop a better framework for deciding when to hire additional labor. What factors would you consider?
Oh, right. Yeah. So when to hire additional labor, this is exactly the same thing, the same analysis that we're doing right here. And you're basically going to look at what are the changes that I'm able to accomplish with that additional labor in comparison to the current situation without that additional labor. And part of that is the economic analysis. So it's just the numbers like, okay, if I hire this many hours of labor, it's going to cost me this much money. And then there's usually an additional factor that you want to calculate in, which is like, it's also going to take me this much estimated extra time in order to manage that labor. So that's going to be an additional expense that you want to think about. There may be other expenses that you need to think about if there's benefits. That's part of the loaded rate, but some of those benefits may not be within the paycheck. They may be things like, do I need to have more tools available? And so do I need to purchase more tools in order to make that person useful? Do we have enough space for them to be working if it's in a pack shed situation? Like, do they actually fit into the current pack shed configuration, or do we need to make changes to the pack shed, and how much is that going to cost? So there could be other changes that result from hiring other than just the dollars per hour that you're paying them. And then you're going to weigh that against what is the additional income that the farm would make if and you're going to have to make some guesses here, and make some estimates. But if you do that out, making your best guesses, then you can start to get a sense of, okay, this is the amount that it's going to cost me, but this is the amount that is going to that's going to generate. And if it generates that amount extra will either pay for or won't pay for those extra expenses in terms of hours and changes to the system that need to be made. Exactly the same processes going through and deciding on whether or not to buy the tool.
Great. Well, any last burning questions for Josh? Okay. Well, As you might have seen, Micah just put a link to an evaluation in the chat. We would really appreciate hearing from you all. It's just a couple minutes, or it'll just take you a couple minutes, and it just gives us a sense of what you took away from the workshop. And we're constantly looking to put on workshops that are useful to farmers and improve them and expand them according to farmers' requests and feedback. So your feedback is super valuable, and we definitely look at all of the responses. So please do take a couple minutes to do that. And it's in the chat. And then I'll also follow up in an email tomorrow with the recording. And so you'll have that in case you want to refer back to it. And I'll put the eval there as well to just do another plug. But yeah, huge thanks to you, Josh, for presenting. Really appreciate it. That was really great. And I didn't really mention much about Viva Farms in this workshop, but just know that Viva, we're an incubator program, and we work with and train a lot of farmers. So if you aren't with the Viva program and are needing support or being connected to resources in any way, you can definitely think of us as a go-to spot to support you, even if you're not in our program, with workshops like this and many other things. So I think with that, if there are no other questions, no other thoughts, we can call it a wrap for the night, but we'll stay on for a few minutes if there's any follow-up. Thanks so much for attending.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
everybody.
you all. Yeah.
I was going to ask Josh real quick, are you going to be in the conference tour or a book tour or anything in the winter? What was the deal?
No, I kind of got slowed down quite a bit by the pandemic a few years ago, and I haven't really picked up a lot of that stuff again. So laying low for now, but yeah, really appreciate doing things like this. Yeah, it's great to get all the questions from folks.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. And also, there was a lot of good back and forth in the chat. So I will also download the chat and pass that along as well if people want to look back at it.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks a lot. I guess I will stop recording.